Hey, Todd, thanks for joining us on the Swick Tech podcast. Really happy to have you here virtually with us today. Looks like you got a really beautiful background of some trees there. And we were kind of joking earlier on, I had a woodpecker land on my wall outside the house here, so that's kind of funny. But if you could take a second and just introduce yourself for those that might not know who you are in our audience, and certainly those that know you in your audience, they'll be happy to hear who you are.
Sure. I'm Todd McLees. I'm an independent consultant working within advanced manufacturing, the future of work. I used to, until a few days ago, I used to travel around the country and speak to large audiences about the future of work. But today, all of those conferences are either canceled or moving online.
Yeah, we were going to do this in person,
going,
right?
What's that?
How's the online piece of that going? Has that been a pretty unique new experience to have those webinars for an entire conference?
Well, I think they're just spinning up and being rescheduled that way. I think any of the conferences that were scheduled for this week, or a couple of smaller, group meetings, peer meetings like executive agenda and so forth, they just got canceled this week. But
sure,
it'll be interesting to see what happens with group dynamics in terms of, 50 attendees in a Zoom conference or a Teams meeting or whatever the case may be.
Yeah, that's going to be a way different environment for sure.
Right.
We just did an all-company meeting this morning with 30 people on Teams. We were talking about how the bandwidth is going to get stressed out from that happening from more and more companies as people continue to jump on.
That's a great point. I think the bandwidth, I think the effectiveness of how you present online this way, as opposed to, there's a little bit of margin for error when you're standing in front of a room. But when you're talking to 30 individual screens or 100 individual screens, I think the stakes go up in terms of clarity of message and so forth.
Yeah, you're pretty good in front of an audience. You kind of take command of the room with your presence and how you kind of walk about the floor and the stage. We've had you present at our tech summit last year, and I've seen you present at other places. So this is a little bit more intimate. Now we're talking face to face through a screen. It is different.
No question. It's a little less natural, I would say, a little less engaging, a little less intimate, as you use the term. It's a little harder to connect online. I think that'll become increasingly important for leadership teams now because, as people are isolated, depending on the culture, they're going to need some replacement for the human-to-human connectivity that we rely on every day. Whether that be with clients or with our peers in the office, as that continues to be put on hold, the face-to-face, the one-on-ones and the small group meetings, the stakes are going to go up in terms of our ability to effectively communicate to people, to have them feel connected to the purpose of work, the culture that we do have. It'll be interesting to see how effective we are at maintaining that over the next, however long it takes, 3-6 months, whatever they're thinking about at this point.
Sure. Shane, did you have a thought?
Yeah, no, I was just thinking through that, and kind of, it's crazy to think that we're going to have to change how we operate. Like you were saying today, Eric, we had a 30-person all-staff meeting for our company, and it felt kind of weird, right? Some people didn't really feel comfortable turning their videos on. Other people were like, sure, I'll turn my video on. But then it's kind of this weird vibe going on between different staff on our team. And that's 30 people. So I can't imagine what it's going to look like for some of these larger companies that have to hold conferences or, all staff meetings for hundreds of thousands of people.
That's 30 people that work together too, right?
Right.
I mean,
yeah.
The other
day,
an
intimate setting already.
That's right. Last Friday, I was on the phone with, I think there were 3 or 4 different companies on the call, and it was held over WebEx. And I think I was the only one who didn't hop on video camera, right? So I think that's a little adjustment that many of us are going to have to make to be more comfortable with this mode of communication. I think it'll come quickly though, because I was just texting my dad, who's sort of self-quarantined at the moment or isolated, and I think there'll be a lot more family communication that goes this way as well in the near term, or personal communication. So it'll just become more and more the norm rather quickly, I would think.
So the Jetsons is really starting to be forced upon us.
Yeah, well, yeah, the old Jetsons cartoons are a pretty poor form of FaceTime at the moment.
I suppose so.
Yeah, I think we're seeing a lot of FaceTime already with, younger generations seem to use it way more, even just in general before this scenario. So yeah, it'll be interesting to see how many more people pick that type of communication up just out of the sheer force of having to.
So, Todd, we had talked a little bit last week, and you're putting together some kind of modeling around the capability maturity model for on the spectrum of 1 to 5. How mature are you in terms of your capability to go remote? And there was kind of two flavors of that as we were talking about it, which is, do you have the technical ability to actually deploy that and execute on that to enable remote work, technically speaking? And then what is the operation side of that, the KPIs, the OKRs, as you call them? That's one of the other sides of that coin. You've been bouncing around all over the city this morning, it sounds like, and this afternoon already. What have you seen so far? You work with some pretty big brands in the area.
Yeah, I think it's a very mixed bag, and it very much depends on culture. I think this is a people first issue. There are organizations that are well suited right now culturally to maintain some semblance of productivity within their organization. I think the technical tools, like we're on Teams right now, I think the tools will help a lot. But in large part, I think, if we think about all of those solutions as apps, what's really important is the operating system, and a sense of purpose is one of those things that's really important. The culture, the connectivity, the cadence around communication. So yes, I'm a big believer in objectives and key results, or OKRs, which was born at Intel in the 70s, and many of the large high-performing companies leverage OKRs today. But it doesn't really matter. I mean, if you're an EOS shop and you're using rocks and tasks and so forth, or if you're using objectives and key results, the language is the language. And it's an important piece of it, actually. The organization is, the dynamic is called familiarity. So whatever operating system you're using, OKRs, EOS, as long as it's something that everybody in the organization is familiar with, so you don't have to spend 5 minutes, getting on the same page just around vocabulary, is really important. So that level of communication becomes an important consideration right now. I think the cadence around communication, you see, companies like ADP with their standout app talking about weekly check-ins. Now they're doing that to simply increase employee engagement. We already have a situation where engagement is better than it's been, but it's not as good as it could be. And now with people not coming into work every day, we have to be thinking about the OS, the systems and processes that we have to put in place, not only from a top-down standpoint, but from a peer-to-peer standpoint in terms of accountability and hyper-transparency, or radical transparency, as McKinsey talks about. We have to be thinking about these kinds of qualities in our communication and in our day-to-day work, that we don't have to be as focused on it typically, because we're able to rely on the person-to-person communication that occurs as a natural part of just coming into the office on a regular basis, if not every day.
Todd, you mentioned the culture concept as part of that operating system. Like, you need to have a culture that lets you kind of build this work remote or work from home environment. What are the things, or the key indicators that you look for to tell you that a company has that type of culture, that they can sustain this type of environment?
It's really hard in a situation like this one, Shane, where what's going on is so critical, and many business owners, especially small and medium-sized business owners, are wondering if they can make payroll in 2 weeks or 4 weeks or whatever the case may be. I mean, these are hard times. So it's hard to talk about some of these things that are typically thought of as fluff, right? But a sense of purpose in the organization is the best way. Only 4% of employees today are home-based, typically. a sense of purpose, a sense of connectivity is so important, especially the longer this goes. I think it's so important to keep a balanced perspective on what needs to be done in the next 2 to 4 weeks. And some of the content I put out on LinkedIn today from Deloitte and McKinsey and so forth are checklists on how to triage some of these really tough situations that companies are dealing with. But we also have to be thinking about, as we flatten the curve, part of that strategy is going to stretch this out a little bit. And if we get into 3 and 6 months, the people that already feel disconnected, which is 2 out of 3 workers, that distance is just going to grow as we isolate and we don't have that daily connectivity. So it's so important to manage that. And it really does start with establishing, if not in a position to remind people, establishing that sense of purpose as to why the organization exists and why what the employee does is important and how it ties to that purpose. That's a big foundational aspect of culture.
Sure.
So how does that, I guess, in your opinion and or expertise, how does a company go about cascading that down and making sure it gets to those folks that are, at the caboose end of that they get that sense of purpose? What's a good way to go about that?
Well, it goes well beyond declaring your mission statement and throwing something up on the wall at this point, right? It requires authenticity. It requires open communication. It requires a little bit of soul searching. If the organization hasn't already declared what their purpose is, or what Peter Diamandis calls the massive transformative purpose, if you don't have that sense of togetherness around a common cause, the common function of what the company does, then it's time to dig into that. And that's a process that doesn't have to take long. I mean, it's literally, you can declare that within a day or so. You can figure out how to best articulate that message, and you can make sure that you get people rallied around it. It's right now, if this is going to go on for a protracted period of time, right now is a critical time to create that connectivity. Or 30 or 60 days from now, as that distance continues to grow, there'll be an opportunity for many others to start looking around for jobs. If you think about what's going to happen here, or likely to happen, if this goes on for an extended period of time, there will be significant reductions in staff for some companies. Some companies will go out of business. And then at the end of this process, let's say that's 90 days, 120 days, 180 days from now, right? As some the New York Mayor de Blasio was talking about 6 months at a minimum yesterday, right? Como in New York is talking about 9 months and so forth. So that's an unknown. But the longer it goes, the harder it will be to keep everybody that you
Kind of like
want
herding
to
cats
keep.
at that point, a little bit, right?
A little bit, yeah. I mean, I
not
can
the
see
herding
us.
part, but like to make sure everyone's, you got to do a lot of check-ins. I would think even like personalized check-ins or like quick little one-offs. If a leader says, I have an open door policy, you come see me anytime, they should be actively walking out of that theoretical digital virtual door now and having a one-to-one conversation for 5 minutes with as many people as they can in a day, if it's a big organization or team leads or whoever, to make sure that people feel what you're talking about, that cultural point, that they can really feel like they're driving towards that purpose.
I think it's a great point. I wouldn't limit that to managers and directors down. Right. I would also be insisting on the peer-to-peer communication with something like, scrums, agile methodologies with scrumming, where you have a specific reason, not meeting for the sake of meeting, but some structure to a conversation to increase the level of communication and connectivity. This is also a time where you might start looking at some of the things that you've been thinking about doing but aren't getting done. As if business slows down a little bit and you're able to stay on path with keeping the team intact and so forth, this is the time where you can start thinking about adding capabilities and competencies to the organization so you emerge stronger. There's really 3 horizons here. What do I have to do to triage just to make sure I can stabilize right now? And then how do I strengthen my organization so I can stick around for the long haul? And then lastly, how do I emerge stronger from this as an organization so I can really thrive and have some market or competitive advantage because of what we achieved during this period of time? Again, as we sit here on March 16th, given where we're at in this process with, the government essentially saying we haven't leveled off here yet. We've not seen the worst. It's really hard to think in these terms as people are having tough conversations with their banks, their accounting firms today. They're thinking about cash flow. They're thinking about business continuity. They're thinking about customer relationships that are in danger. Their supply chain is at risk.
Yep.
There are some really hard operational issues. But as you create that core team working on triaging the issues related to coronavirus, part of the strategy has to be mid and long term as well. Get ready for a protracted struggle here.
Yeah, I don't think we've even begun to consider or realize how long this could be, right? We're all in like you said, March 16th. This is like day one of us working remotely. And some of us, I feel like a lot of people think, well, it's just like a 1 or 2 week thing. No, this could be 6 months plus where we're trying to figure out how to live this way and operate businesses this way.
And that might be the best outcome as opposed to that big spike that, Italy and other countries are experiencing, right? If we flatten that curve, what we're betting on is that we don't get above the healthcare capacity threshold, and it gives us an opportunity to remain functional, but that will take a longer period of time.
Mm-hmm.
Not to mention, we haven't really discussed like the actual bad, terrible, worst case outcome of this thing is that people close to you actually die. The being isolated, the not going out to places, things are closed up. I can't take my kids to the YMCA to go swimming. There's not a lot of activity-based things to do. Movie theaters are closing, restaurants are potentially closing, gyms are closing. We're still in this cold weather period. Who knows how long it's going to take before we see another flurry or two, and when that's going to end. And if this is protracted, like you had said, and some things happen closer to home for you, how are people going to, stay happy, right?
Yeah, this is Monday. On Saturday, the gyms were still full, right?
Yep.
The restaurants were still full. And so it's very early. But, to me, just based on all of the potential for tragedy and so forth, as you think about culture, this is a time for authentic empathy and compassion as well from everybody, but certainly from leadership, right? Without that, it'd be very difficult to maintain any semblance of a culture that, family's got to be there at this point. And it'll be really interesting to see how that plays out.
Yeah. On a positive note, though, sorry to go all doom and gloom on everybody, but the staying connected piece. I think Shane and I and Ryan had jumped on a couple calls. Ad hoc just jumped in, and hey, how's it going? What do you got going on? How can I help you with this? So that was nice to be able to have that connectedness there. But also, at SWCTech, we utilize Office 365 and Teams to the absolute fullest. It's our phone system. It's our file share. It's our communications platform. We use Planner, so we have our to-dos through Traction EOS in there. But the collaboration piece is powerful. So if we're working on things together as a team, we can all be in the same dock working at the same time, building out whatever it is we're trying to accomplish. That stuff that to me is kind of fun. I really like that coming together that way.
Well, I think the technology is going to play an important role. As you think about the different capability maturities as it relates to working remotely, if you have your level 1 company, it's essentially the Wild West, right? You don't have performance management systems in place. You don't have communication systems in place. You don't have weekly or daily process in terms of check-ins and stand-ups and so forth. Level 2, what happens in a situation like this one, where if you're a level 1 company, the knee-jerk reaction is to level 2, which is a control mechanism, right? How do I control the situation? How do I monitor employees to make sure that they're still productive? And exactly. That's exactly the right reaction, Shane. That's not a great long-term strategy. You might get, a few days of a burst of productivity remotely because you're sort of laying down the law, assuming that you're telling the employees that this is what you're doing. What's much better is to jump right away as fast as you can to a level 3 or level 4 thought process, where it's more about management and collaboration and goal setting and challenging people, their skills to the challenges that you're putting out. You're infusing elements of optimized productivity into every process that you build. Heightened communication, clear goals, immediate feedback cycles. This is a time where neuroscience really comes into play. You can really sort of hit the brain in terms of what it takes to both connect and be productive. And one of the ways to really destroy that is to just go into a police state, wondering what the inbounds and outbounds are and email volumes and phone calls and time that they're logged in and so forth. Instead, this is the time to fully engage, not just from top down, but to encourage everybody to engage with one another using tools like video conferencing and putting systems in place that really push people to achieve more than they thought they could working remotely. And if you could get that off the ground very quickly, you have a really good chance to be performing at a level higher than other companies will.
So, Todd, a lot of this stuff translates directly from not working remotely, right? Working in the office is where a lot of this comes from, and the idea that you should build this better version of a culture where you're not actively monitoring, but instead people are engaged and want to be doing their work. I feel like that becomes a lot harder now when you're forced to go remote all of a sudden like this. So, like, let's say you have a company culture that is a level 1 or a level 2. And you've been trying actively to change that to get to a different spot, level 3, 4, 5, and so on, without this challenge of working remote, and that was hard enough. How do you convince companies that it's worth it to try and still do that working remotely in the midst of all of this?
So there's more, in the midst is hard, right? There are more challenges remotely, but not to be trite, never waste a good crisis, right? A lot of innovation takes place in times of crisis. And what your organization needs in order to function at a high level is to move further down the capability maturity scale, further up rather. And what we're asking people to do isn't all that difficult given the tools and technology that are available today.
Sure.
And this is a reason to do it. I mean, just step back for a moment and think about the extraordinary stress that many, many businesses and teams will be under right now. If anything good comes of this situation, it will be the ability to bring teams together to function at a higher level than they would in normal times.
Yeah, which seems to be the way things were going anyways, right? It was just further out in the future. I mean, can't tell you how many articles I've seen about, mobile teams and companies are going to eat up the ones that are on site or what have you, and things like that. This is just accelerating that dramatically.
Yeah, when you read about the future of work, you think about the atomizing of work, so the outsourcing, sort of the Uber of work, right? Individual outsourcing, the gig economy, more and more remote workers around the world, especially as it relates to globalization and digital skill sets and the digital natives and so forth. This could accelerate some of that. It certainly needs to accelerate the ability to connect remotely, not just in the technological sense, but in the human to human sense.
Okay. Yeah, that's good. Good thoughts. I had one other point there I was going to circle back to, and it's escaping my mind. That's okay.
Companies that have the tools, look at what just happened prior to this conversation. You called me and said, hey, could we do this on Teams, right? I downloaded Teams on my iPhone, and within about 2.5 minutes, the four of us are connected through Microsoft Teams, right? This doesn't have to be a heavyweight solution from a technology standpoint, whether you're using Zoom for webinars or you're using Teams and multiple aspects of Teams. You have to figure out what's most valuable to your culture, to your team, in order to be productive. And you can start plugging those things in very quickly. It's the organizations that have technology lined up it'll be easier, right? But I've never used Teams before. We're doing that right now, and
it's pretty easy. It's intuitive.
It didn't take any effort to plug it in.
Yeah. So that's what I was going to say. Sorry. So the presence of Teams, it's a feature presence. It shows right now. It'll show to anyone else in our organization. Shane and I are on a call, and so is Ryan. Someone else might show, out of office, away, in a meeting, et cetera, et cetera. So a good flavor for what people are doing, kind of back to that micromanaging kind of concept of the company at a level one. Maybe it can quiet some of that down for some of those folks, just as a result of them seeing visibly what's actually happening in the organization.
Yeah, I guess the thing is if you are urgent about innovating with regard to your culture or your ability to manage your team remotely, technology doesn't get in the way of that today.
Yeah, all of these apps are super scalable nowadays. Zoom or Teams, you can call them up and, it's a matter of buying a handful of licenses and off you go.
Right.
And we're, obviously we're a Microsoft shop, but I use Teams in some other areas in life, or not Teams, Slack. And that's great too. There's a lot of the Google Hangouts. There's a lot of ways around this from like the tooling, but like you said, it's just, that's not the blocker. It's the other piece potentially. Yeah.
People.
Yeah.
There was a board meeting in Milwaukee today with, 60 or 70 CEOs, and everybody was on a Zoom webinar to accommodate that, right? Because they couldn't come together. So, technology is not a good excuse today in terms of a barrier for communication. What this situation calls for in most organizations is heightened or even hyper communication, hyper transparency, radical openness, and just constantly sharing with one another throughout the day. That's a much better methodology than moving towards monitoring productivity through, background technologies that just track what people are doing throughout the day.
Yeah. Yeah, if you think about it, we're literally opening up our homes to people, right? We're all out of our homes right now. We heard your dog and a bird, and we had squirrels and chipmunks, and you can see some of Shane's pictures in the background. We want to be ultra authentic. So, that speaks to it. It kind of has to be. It's just the nature of your environment, actually.
Right.
Yeah, we'll see where that goes, though. It's when I think of all of that stuff that you were just saying, Todd, it makes me think of you're asking a lot of people who are in positions of authority or leadership or management, what have you, to maybe be a little bit more vulnerable than they're used to in order to help their organization. And so it'll be interesting to see where that goes, who's willing to step out of their comfort zone to do those sorts of things to help their companies grow.
Yeah, I think from top to bottom in an organization, it'll be interesting to see how that plays out.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
If peers aren't used to communicating across department lines and so forth, the communication chains in many ways have to be adjusted for as long as people are working remotely. I don't think we realize how important that human connectivity is in the office every day. The opportunity to walk over to somebody's desk or to see them in the hallway or whatever the case may be, right? Beyond even the relationships that exist at work, there's just the ability to connect immediately if need be. And the longer this goes on and the more isolated we all become, the more difficult it will be to maintain that level of connectivity. And I can't think of any element that's more important to get right out of the gate here and insist that people over communicate throughout the organization.
That makes me think of the scenario of adding a new employee to a company while you all work remote like this, that could be really interesting and challenging to do.
Yeah, onboarding
Integrate
is
them into
already
the
hard, and
framework.
now with
Yeah. Hey, meet all these new people, but virtually.
Because the talent gap hasn't shrunk any, has it? Right?
yeah,
As
exactly.
far as I'm concerned, that need's still there.
Yeah, I want to speak to one thing with regard to CMMI. I think there's an important aspect here around level 5. Level 5, which is, a level that most of us don't really aspire to get to typically when you think about capability maturity. Level 5 is filled with what are known as flow triggers. So McKinsey did a 10-year study on being in a flow state. And what they came back out of after 10 years, they said that executives in flow are 5 times more productive than when they're not in flow. Okay? 5 times more productive. There are 10 individual triggers and 10 group triggers in flow. We talked about familiarity being one of them, but clear goals is another. Immediate feedback is another. So very short closed loop cycles, right? These are the types of things that increase the neurochemistry that make us more productive as human beings. And so if you just look at the list of 10 flow triggers for individual performance, and being in a state of flow is when we feel our best and we perform our best. And if you look at that list, you will find that there are many where it's quite intuitive that you can build that into this remote capabilities, right? Hyper communication, immediate feedback, clear goals, familiarity, etc. When you start plugging those into the process, you give yourself a better chance. Okay, you give yourself a better chance to increase productivity from the bottom of where it could be now that we're all working remotely. So these are just little level 5 techniques that you can apply regardless of what level you're sitting at today to accelerate performance improvement in your remote team.
Todd, thanks for your time on the call today.